Hey Don, I want to show you my setup here. Had a good Thanksgiving myself. Glad you got to see your daughters. I get to see a bunch of family too. But just realized when I go through this setup, I didn't get here overnight. I spent a year or over a year building this stuff and was brewing the whole while. So you can do this with a lot less. But I have a gravity system, so I've made this cart which I can wheel around, and I've mounted, this is mounted on here, so I've got one burner mounted up there, and this is my kettle where I heat the water. I put a sight line on this one, so you can see the 10-gallon mark. There's a 15-gallon mark, and right now I have a little over 13 gallons of water heating up in here. From there, I can run it through a tube. And this is my mash tun. It's just a cooler, and this is called a Manifold type of mash tun. So you see I've got a copper manifold in there. This has grooves cut in the bottom of it. And when I mash, I'll show you a little bit more about this. But basically, this is to keep, you seat your grain bed in the mash tun. And now whenever I take after the mash is done and I take the liquid off of this, I want to leave all the grain behind and no silt or anything. And so that's what the manifold does. All the slits are facing down. So I'll get the grain bed seated. It's a process called Vorlauf. All these have German words. So I'll Vorlauf it, which will seat the grain bed, and then I'll be able to take it to my boil pot. So you can see everything runs through tubes. So I'll heat the water. I'll use my sight line to put the amount that I want in there through the tube. Tubes are new, so they're still kind of pigtailed. And then it'll go into the mash tun. It'll mash for 60 to 90 minutes, depending on the beer. From the mash tun, then I can draw it through a tube into my boil pot. My boil pot is a little bit different than my heating pot. There's no sight line on it. I don't need to measure the water that goes in there. It's another keg that I've converted. So these are 15-gallon pots. The difference is inside the boil pot, I've got this strainer. And so any hops that might escape when I boil, I use hops in a bag, and you can either put them in a bag and just drop them in the boil. I suspend them. I'll show you that when I get to the boil, but I suspend the bag. That way I can add hops at different times. Some recipes call for that. But anything that should escape that's big, that comes from the mash tun or from the hop bag or from any, what they call adjuncts, any additional ingredients that you put in, that'll help strain out before it goes through this tube into a 5-gallon bucket, which is how I'll ferment. So this is just an overview of my setup, and it works real good. You can see underneath here some of my other stuff. This is called a wort chiller. So after the boil, I want to chill the wort down to room temperature as quickly as possible. I used to do that with an ice bath. Now I can simply take this coil and hook it up to a hose and run water through it. And water will run through the coil and out the other end. And as it does so, that cold water is going to draw heat off of the wort, because I can just stick that into the boil pot. I'll sanitize it and put it right into the wort inside the boil pot to help draw off all the heat. All this I made myself. This pot here, the boil pot, I actually did the valve myself. It's a bolt-on, so that's not welded. It's just bolted and washers. But the second pot I did with the sight line, I had my brother, who has a company that has all the equipment to do this. They cut these holes and welded these fittings on for me. A luxury I had because of his business, basically. So you got to get your water up to temperature. It's called a strike temp. It needs to be 164 degrees. Why isn't that show on the cycle? I don't know if you can see the temperature on there because of the, must be something to do with the frame cycle or something. But anyway, I'm at right around 160 now, 158. It's bouncing around a little bit. I want a strike temperature of 164 degrees. That's because it needs to, when it hits the grain, I want it to be at 152 degrees once it finishes. So there's calculators online you can use to figure out what your strike temp is based on the amount of grain you're going to use and everything. I'm going to warm this mash tun up real quick. I'm going to draw just a little bit of water off of this and warm this up. Just put a little bit of water in here in order to warm it to a temperature. As I'm outside, it's about 50 degrees out here right now, but I don't want that mash tun to be that hot, that cold when I put the grain on and when the water hits it. I'm not going to be able to see that thermometer. All right, well, I'm going to end this one, and I'll hit you again after I put the grain in once the water reaches strike temperature. Oh, I did want to show you, I work off of, this is my recipe sheet. This comes from an online calculator. Tasty Brew is gone. That website's gone. This is a recipe I've had for a while. I put notes, and I really should put more, but this is what I figured out for the mash on this. So I'm going to need 8 gallons, because I'm doing a 10-gallon batch. So I'm going to need 8 gallons of initial water at 164 degrees. And then I'll sparge, which means I'll rinse the grain with another 8 gallons. By the time I lose it due to absorption from the grain and loss from my mash tun, little things like that, those 16 gallons will probably translate into about 12 gallons in the boil pot. And when I boil, it should boil off almost 2 gallons. I should end up with 10 gallons of beer to ferment. All right, I'll send you another one here in just a little bit.